Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to focus in on the power of the collaboration of a rook and a knight, and specifically one specific pattern that you'll see beautifully demonstrated right in our first position. Here we go. Wow, what a position this is! Black has pretty much all the pieces on the board, while all what white has is a rook and a knight in addition to the king. However, as unfortunate as the black pieces are positioned, it is white who wins. And this is an absolutely ideal demonstration of the pattern that we'll focus this lesson on. When a king is cornered and the rook gets to the 7th rank together with a knight coming to f6, obviously the same could be in any of the other 4 corners of the board, oftentimes the threatening checkmate on h7 is unstoppable, just like in this position. Black may delay the end by putting several pieces in the rook's way on the 7th rank, but after white simply capturing all of those pieces, eventually will checkmate with rook to h7 at the end of the day. After this really visual demonstration of the power of this pattern, let's go and see some other idea about a similar pattern. Here again, white has the rook on the 7th rank, the knight on f6. However, the black king is not cornered on h8. Therefore, white cannot checkmate. We can also see that black has significant material advantage, having his queen and having a far advanced passed pawn on f2, in fact threatening to checkmate in various ways. However, remember, this is another pattern. White, thanks to the checkmate idea that we've seen in the previous position, is able to force a draw by perpetual checks, namely knight to h7, king e8, knight back to f6, king f8, knight back to h7, and back to f6, and black better does not go to the corner because of the checkmate on h7, but go to f8, and the game ends in a draw. Well, after these basic examples, let's see some more complex ways on how to get there. Here we go. In this position, black has a whole bunch of extra pawns. And in fact, the knight on e5 is under heavy fire. It's true that the black bishop on g7 is also under attack, and white would be able to capture that bishop right away, but then the black rook would capture the knight on e5, black maintaining his significant material advantage. However, in this position, based on the pattern we discussed in the first position of this lesson, white is able to win the game in just a couple more moves. But how can white force the black king to the corner so we can create our pattern of having the rook on the 7th and the knight on c6 and then checkmate on a7? Well, after you trying to figure it out, here comes the solution. Check on a8. Now the black king cannot go to c7 because checkmate would arrive immediately with rook to d7. Therefore, after the check on a8, black is better off going to b7. And here comes the amazing part. White is able to give up on his rook on the corner by playing rook d7, in fact forcing the black king to do so to capture the rook and to get to the corner. And now we have it on the other side of the board than in the first position, and the knight arrives to c6, and black cannot stop the checkmate on a7, can delay it by a move or two, but not stop the checkmate. Let's move on to the next position, where for a change it is black's turn. And in fact, the black queen is right away under attack. The good news is that black already has his rook on b2 on the second rank, and also the black knight on e5 is already positioned to jump to f3. The bad news is that in the meantime, the f3 square is controlled by the white queen. And by the time the black queen would move away, for example, to b4, white could even bring his bishop to e2 or g2 and put even more protection on the f3 square. However, the beautiful part here is that black doesn't need to watch any cost. As long as the black knight would be able to get to f3 without being captured, that would mean that the checkmate would follow on the following move after the king moves to h1 and rook h2. So what this means, that black can even try to give his queen up as long as the white queen no longer will guard the f3 square. Well, hopefully this was enough hint for you to find the solution. And the correct move is to play queen e1. A beautiful move, which obviously cannot be captured without getting checkmated after knight f3. And also, it creates several threats. On one hand, simply to capture the white queen on d1, and then checkmate with knight f3, and also to play queen f2 on the following move and checkmate on h2. A very elegant move. Let's move on to the next position. In this position, black is a rook ahead as well as a pawn. However, again you can see our key pattern, the rook being on the 7th rank, the knight on f6, and the black king on the corner. However, how is it important when black also has a pawn on f7? The rook obviously cannot jump over it and checkmate on h7. Our queen is under attack, and by the time the white queen moves away from the attack, black will have time to move his rook away from the attack or get his queen back towards the defense from a2, where for the moment it's a bit out of play. However, black will not have the time to do all of that if white here finds the correct move. Again, I suggest you pause the video and try to figure out the correct move for yourself. Obviously, if white does not find the correct move here, white will be in trouble. White should be looking for a way to somehow get rid of this pawn on f7. And the correct answer here is playing bishop d5. Quite a beautiful move, closing off the diagonal where the black queen was protecting the pawn on f7. Now, if the rook or the knight captures the bishop, finally white is able to get that f7 pawn and create the deadly checkmate threat with rook h7. Capturing the white knight on f6 wouldn't solve anything because the white queen would just recapture with a check, followed by checkmate on g7. And otherwise, if after bishop d5, black does not capture the bishop and tries to hang on to the f7 pawn, white would have a discovered check by moving the knight from f6 to e8 or h5 and then checkmate with queen g7. The next example is from a real game played in 1967. In this position, black is a pawn ahead, but it's quite visible that white has a strong attack, having his queen facing the black king, the two knights beautifully centralized, and, very importantly, the white rook on the third rank ready to swing over to the king's side to aid the attack. Here again, white has an elegant sequence of moves to materialize their attack. Here is how it should start, how the game continued. Rossolimo traded bishop for knight, black recaptured, and white followed using the pin and give a check on f6, forcing the black king to the corner. All this is nice and beautiful, but how to follow it up? Right now, the knight is hanging on f6. Actually, white has several ways to win the game. One of them is to immediately bring the rook over to the king's side, threaten with checkmate on h7, and then, when pawn takes knight, play queen to f5, threatening checkmate. If knight protects with knight g5, then queen takes pawn on f6 and then captures the knight. And if black tries to protect the h7 pawn with an x-ray, then white simply blocks that with knight d3 and wins the game. However, this is not the most beautiful way to win the game. White has an even more elegant way by playing the amazing queen g6. Look at this move, how beautiful this is. Well, it's a sacrifice that can be captured in two different ways, but after either, black will end up getting checkmate very, very quickly. Black responded by playing queen c2, again trying to defend the h7 square through an x-ray method, but white simply just brings another piece to the attack, and black cannot avoid the loss of serious material. A very beautiful example. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Wow, this is an endgame where it's quite hard to imagine how will we get to our pattern. Quite amazingly, there's not much white can do to avoid it. That's why it's so important to have these and many other patterns engraved in our mind and use our creativity to get there. In this position, which is also from a real game between Taimanov and Larsen, black continued by playing knight to g4. On one hand, this move protects the pawn on h5, attacks the pawn on f2, but actually black has a much more sneaky idea, as you will see. White played rook to d1 with the idea to follow up with a check on a4 and then rook d7 check. But black had a much trickier plan than just capturing the pawn on f2 by playing rook g5, followed by king h8, and voila, here we go, the same pattern, the king in the corner, knight on f6, and the rook is coming down on g8. White gave one more check, but at the end of the day, the checkmate is unavoidable. Quite impressive. The next one is a very typical combination to use this pattern, a real easy one. An experienced player should figure this one out real quick. And if it's white to move, which it was in the game, it was a game by the American chess legend called Tarnowski, white just sacrifices the queen to open up the g-file and to get to our pattern checkmate with rook g8. Let's move on to our next position. Here we go. And this is also a very famous position played by the first official chess world champion, William Steinitz, against Reiner in 1860. That is a long time ago, almost 150 years. In this position, it was Black's turn, and Black clearly has a lead in development because of the white pieces are still all sleeping on the queen side. But Black actually has an immediate way to take advantage of the circumstances and of the fact that the white pieces are not participating in the action. And here, again, using that same idea, we're trying to imagine the white rook being gone for g4 and then ready to checkmate on g1. And here is the move that accomplishes that, queen h4. Simply attacking the rook a second time, in addition threatening to checkmate on h2 if rook takes queen, then of course checkmate, rook g1, and after rook g2, not the only but the fastest and most impressive win, similarly to the last example, just queen takes pawn, forcing rook takes queen, and checkmate. Beautiful. Let's move on to our next example. This is also from a real game between Winter and Cole from 1930. In this position, it is Black's turn, and we see our key participants, the Black Knight and the Black Rook, getting there. But White seems to be pretty solid also at the same time, having all the three pawns in their initial squares on the king's side, and the white bishops are defending as well. The good news is for Black that Black also has a bishop on b7 on the long diagonal in an ideal position, pinning the pawn on g2. Also, there is another pin in the position on the c file. So things are going pretty well for Black. What is important in such situation is that time is the essence. If Black plays a few unambitious moves, kind of just trying to improve the position little by little, it would give White the time to, for example, get his queen out of the pin on the c-file and improve, activate a little bit the position of his pieces, and having a pair of bishops and some space advantage in the center and on the queen side actually do quite well. But reality is that it was Black's turn, and White never got to do all those things that he'd need time for. Black continued by playing knight to f3. This move, on one hand, opens up the diagonal of the Black queen for the queen to get to h4 or g5, depending on how White continues. Another idea is for the knight to appear on h4 and put further pressure on that g2 pawn. If pawn captures knight, in addition to bishop capturing on f3, which is pretty good, even better would be to play queen g5 and come down on g1, checkmate. After knight came to f3, White responded by d5, trying to neutralize the Black bishop on b7. But Black can and should continue aggressively by playing queen to h4, threatening with an immediate checkmate. If pawn captures the knight, again the Black queen would come to g5 and the checkmate would be unavoidable. On the other hand, after h3, a very common combination, again creating the same pattern we're discussing in this lesson, queen captures pawn, opening the g-file, and the rook comes down. Very nice example. And let's see one more example on this theme. Here we go. Again, we do see our participants, the Black Knight on c3, the Rook on b7. However, things are not quite as obvious. How will that result in checkmate? In the meantime, there are two pieces in between on the b-file, the knight on b4, the pawn on b2, and moreover, the white rook on c1 conveniently guards the b1 square. Nevertheless, if black finds the correct sequence of moves, the checkmate arrives in just 3 moves. Black to move, checkmate in 3. Try to figure out the beautiful combination. And here is the answer. Queen takes, opening up the b file, opening up completely at the same time removing the guard of the b1 square, and if rook takes knight, check comes down to b1 and game over. A beautiful game. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. This is a beautiful endgame composition by the famous composer Troitsky, and in fact from 1879. In this endgame, it's quite clear that black is ahead in material quite a bit. Remember, if you have a bishop and a knight with no other pieces on the other side, it's a win, but quite a difficult one. And here, black has a rook, a bishop, and 3 additional pawns. Should be an easy win for black, shouldn't it? In fact, if white right now would capture the rook in the corner, which seems like the obvious move, it would be only black would play for a win after playing g2, even though white may save the game. But white's supposed to win this game. How can that happen? If white gives a check with a knight, the black king will just escape. And again, at best, white will get the rook in the corner, and black will have no worry about losing this game. Amazingly, the solution is giving up the white bishop, namely by moving to g2, forcing the black king into a very unfortunate square. After knight f4, again the king has no other choice than moving down to g1. And now, after king e1, black is in a zugzwang. Quite amazingly, black cannot move but with his pawn from g3, and that will result an immediate checkmate. I hope you enjoyed this beautiful jewel of the week, and of course the rest of the lesson that focused on a special pattern, a very common pattern of a rook and knight checkmate. I showed you 11 examples. Of course, there are hundreds, if not thousands more from real games that people checkmate in that very way, the king being cornered, the knight being diagonally 2 squares away from the corner, usually on f6 or c6, of course on a white side f3 or c3, and then the rook checkmate may come from h7 or sometimes from g8. Well, hopefully you will be able to use this pattern to your benefit in your own games, as well as, of course, avoiding falling into traps of your opponent. Thank you for listening. So long. I'll be back with more chess goodies and knowledge next week. Bye-bye.